Icons of Evolution, Darwin's Tree of Life. Now, what we're looking at in this study is not the presuppositional basis of evolutionism versus creation or anything of that nature. It's a discussion I have another time. What we're looking at is I'm going through a book written by a biologist, written by an evolutionist named Jonathan Wells, who is looking critically and seriously at the so-called scientific evidence that is commonly propounded in textbooks that are pictures of so-called evidence for evolution that scientists have long known have been proven wrong over sometimes 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Now, what we're looking at is just his examination of these different things. We've looked at the Miller-Urey experiment. We've looked at the introduction to his book in a previous section, and he talks about the nature of pictures being used in textbooks, even though the evidence is not what textbook authors claim it is. So what we want to do is real science, examine the evidence empirically and examine the evidence philosophically, and we're not making claims as to worldview at this point. We're just looking at the evidence itself that we commonly read in 10th grade biology, for example. And one we're going to look at today is Darwin's Tree of Life from the Origin of Species. Darwin drew out this drawing in his Origin of Species of this idea of the Tree of Life. And as you can see down here, it starts with, you can see these letters from the alphabet. And the theory was that this tree would continue to branch out and grow as descent with modification happened, as natural selection took place. The idea was that there would be these changes, and you go from a few simple organisms that would modify by some mechanism, changing into other kinds over a long period of time. Okay, so Darwin's theory, and then Darwin's theory has a point as far as it goes, but let's look at the evidence for this. Jonathan Wells, the author of his book, writes, no one knows how the first living cells originated, but most biologists think that the event was so improbable that it happened only once, or at most a few times. Okay, so again, remember, this is not something that's empirically verifiable. It's something that it has happened in the past, that cannot be repeated, that cannot be demonstrated, that cannot be proven, at least in that purest empirical sense. And so Wells admits, has a little bit of humility here, that no one really knows how the first living cells originated, at least in the sense of what is claimed by modern theories of life. I think there's some inconsistencies with even his statement there. But the presupposition is presuming to know that the first cells originated without evidence. Now, what I don't mean is we know that cells exist. We know that living cells exist. But we don't know, there's no proof in nature of this event where they say that they emerge for the first time. That is not science. Science is observed, it is testable, it is repeatable, it assumes laws of logic, it assumes a world that has stability in it in a general sense, where we can assume that the future in general will be like the present or be like the past. A lot of these things come down to basic presuppositions in philosophy. So already there, that's one of the issues. But Darwin's tree of life, Darwin himself wrote in Origin of Species his theory. He said, I view all things not as special creations, but as lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Cambrian system was well deposited. So Darwin's theory is this. It's not special creation, but rather lineal descendants from some few beings. The few become many over time, with modification, with natural selection being the mechanism. And his theory is that the fossils, that this all happened before the Cambrian level of the fossil record, which is the Cambrian is the lowest one. It's thought to be the oldest. It's the one that holds uh, usually all kinds of creatures that don't move and things of that nature. And Darwin's theory is this, that the first living things started out from a few sources and then diverged and grew into a tree, branching out more and more and more, all having this commonality of one or a few common ancestors in the past. And he believed that this happened before that Cambrian level, before that Cambrian time period. He also wrote, all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth may be descended from some one primordial form, meaning some uh, pond or something, as Darwin said in another place. So this is where he draws out his theory of the tree of life, that it starts down here at the bottom with a few diverges over time through evolution, changing to other kinds, not simply just natural selection, as we'll see, but actually adding information, changing in some way, developing over time, and becoming a new species or a new kind. Okay, so Origin of Species, this is the only illustration or the only picture in Origin of Species, and it's the Darwinian tree of life. So the theory is that beginning at the bottom, common ancestor or ancestors, a few of them, through evolutionary descent, came to be all living things that currently exist and that have existed in the past at any time. This was Darwin's theory. Now, this tree of life is very common to see in science textbooks as evidence for, well, not evidence, but as the theory for evolution, which they claim that there's evidence for this specific aspect of it. Neo-Darwinist Ernst Mayr said in 1991, there is probably no biologist left today who would question that all organisms now found on Earth descended have descended from a single origin of life. Now, there could be some philosophical problems with this in the sense that it's a qualifying statement. No biologist. Well, what defines a biologist? Someone who agrees with this theory? Well, then, yeah, of course, that's what's a scientist? Someone who already agrees with a certain paradigm and never questions it. Um, that may be the case, but nobody is left today. And are these things decided by majority? Well, obviously not. But is it just okay? Most people believe it, therefore it's accepted as a fact. Now, those things may have validity to them as far as they go in a basic sense, but there are limits to that. He says that they believe that they have descended from a single origin of life. Well, why not multiple origins? I mean, why this one single point, right? So anyway, there's some serious problems with Darwin's tree of life, and I put this up here kind of facetiously, kind of jokingly, but it's upside down. What the evidence shows, what actually goes on in the world. Reality is that the early fossil records turned the tree upside down. What the early fossil records demonstrate and look at is not that a few became many, but that many became few. And natural selection, that idea of that there are changes within and that adaptations because certain adaptations benefit species and that helps them to survive as opposed to those who have those things and that gets passed on to their children. Nobody's questioning that. That's something that we all can agree on. That's something that we see in breeding. That's something that we see in nature. That's something that we could observe today empirically. But Tree of Life says the opposite. It says that a few sources, or even one, diverged into many before the Cambrian period. And so Darwin knew, and scientists have confirmed the fossil record. Now, Darwin thought fossil record is very incomplete, and he's right. The things destroyed and laid down in the fossil record over time. I mean, how much can you gain from that in the sense that you know where the final origin of all this stuff was? There's descent with natural selection, but it deletes information. It does not add information. So when a creature with an adaptation that does not help it survive dies off and becomes extinct, that information from the DNA has been deleted from the gene pool. And that's what we see as creatures become distinct and go out of existence. That information goes away, but information being added, as would have to be the case with Darwin's tree of life, new information is not added. It's adapted, but it's not the same thing. Jonathan Wells writes, although you learn it from reading modern biology textbooks, Darwin's tree of life has been uprooted. So students are still presented with this as a true theory, even though the fossil record doesn't demonstrate it. Scientists know it's not the case. It's not the case biologically, in the sense that there's been deletion of information. There has not been adding of information as far as DNA to living organisms. It's not the pattern that we see in nature. And so why is it still in the textbooks if it's not true? It says, but in Darwin's theory, there is no way phylum level differences could have appeared right at the start. Yet that is what the fossil record shows. So the fossil record is at odds with Darwin's theory. In Darwin's theory, there's no way that the bottom level, the phylum level differences, could have appeared right at the beginning. That's exactly what the fossil record shows. The theory is at odds with the fossil record. Let me explain further some of these problems. When Darwin wrote Origin of Species, the oldest, that is the lowest fossils, they assume it's the oldest because it's the lowest. Makes some sense, but have problems with it because just something's lower, buried underground, does not necessarily mean by definition it's old. But that is how you can arrive at that conclusion. But you have to be careful. You can't say that that's the case necessarily. But when Darwin wrote Origin of Species, the oldest or the lowest fossils were from geographical period called the Cambrian period, which is meant to be the kind of the bottom, the lowest possible. Now, Cambrian fossils did not fit the pattern of Darwin's theory. The Cambrian appears to start with an abrupt appearance of many fully formed phyla of animals and classes of animals. And by animals, I just mean the most general sense, not one or a few that diverged gradually over millions of years. So what we see when we even look at the lowest level, the Cambrian, we don't see all of a sudden, or we don't see this pattern that Darwin predicted, that you have gradual modification. What we see is many fully formed phyla and animal classes that are already there, not one or fewer that diverge over time and become more over time, over millions of years. Darwin was even aware of this problem in his lifetime. He says, if the theory be true, it is indisputable that before the lowest Cambrian stratum, meaning kind of below this kind of fossil level of the bottom, was deposited, long periods elapsed in which the world swarmed with living creatures. Meaning the idea is down here, the world swarmed with living creatures and then came to the Cambrian period. So there's tons of time and time here to diverge and to get to this point of the Cambrian. You also wrote, several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks. So he's saying, he recognizes his problem, that several of the main divisions of animals that we already know, the animal kingdom, are already there, fully formed at the lowest level, when his expectation would be the opposite, that they wouldn't be fully formed, that they wouldn't be there yet, that it would diverge and grow over time. He also wrote, at present, must remain inexplicable. There's no explanation for it. He hoped for an explanation in the future, and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained. So he says, Darwin admitted himself, this is one of the valid challenges to my theory, because his theory is that the few diverge into many through natural selection over an amount of time. But it's not what the tree of life in reality in the fossil record actually demonstrates. What we have is a multiplicity of fully formed phylum and animal classes that actually become fewer over time. And so many believe that that his theory would be vindicated later. And so people started looking through and exploring the fossil record. And they believed that if the fossil record or knowledge was more complete, that this would back up Darwin's theory. But he said only a small portion of the surface of the Earth has been geologically explored, meaning we just don't know what's there in the fossil record, and we definitely don't know what's missing in the fossil record. So maybe this will more information will come at a later time. So he believed that improved knowledge of the Cambrian and Precambrian, the even lower level of fossils, would make it better, but actually our improved knowledge made it worse for this theory of Darwin's tree of life. Many paleontologists are now convinced that the major groups of animals appeared abruptly, meaning, as it were, suddenly out of nowhere. Many fully formed animal kinds and groups and phylum and living organisms appeared out of nowhere. And this is difficult for Darwin's tree of life, because the idea is that no, it started from a single point of origin or a few single points and diverged. But really what we see is all of a sudden there's fully formed living organisms in different classes of their different divisions of species already. at a sudden point. Although you wouldn't know that from reading a biology textbook, because it still holds to this tree of life. Jonathan Wells writes, the fossil evidence is so strong and the event so dramatic that it has become known as the Cambrian explosion, or biology's Big Bang, because there's a sudden appearance of all kinds of different species, not origin from a single point of commonality, descending with modification and diverging into more kinds and species, but rather a sudden appearance, the Cambrian explosion, or biology's Big Bang, meaning all of a sudden all these classes of living beings appeared at once, is what the evidence of the fossil record shows. It's not Darwin's tree of life, although Darwin's tree of life is still used as an example of evidence or theory of evolution that people say that that has been verified, and that's not the case. Wells also writes, the now well-documented Precambrian fossil record does not provide anything like the long history of gradual divergence required by Darwin's theory. So this is a serious challenge to Darwinian evolution, and there are more. You wouldn't know it from a lot of the discussion of evolution, but there are more than one school of thought than just Darwinian evolution. Even among evolutionists, there are other schools of thought that don't follow Darwinism. And so this Precambrian fossil record showing the Cambrian explosion of all this sudden appearance of life and fully formed animals does not match what we see here in this Darwinian tree of life. The Precambrian knowledge of the fossil record disproved or gave serious, valid evidence against Darwin's theory. So this was disproven a long time ago, yet is still used in textbooks. It's not that anybody's necessarily doing anything underhanded. Textbooks get old, they get outdated, but it's not being corrected. And it's even by people who know the mistake is there, don't correct the error or put it in there and say this was Darwin's theory, but it's been disproven. Now, maybe some textbooks do that, but a lot of them don't. And so that's a major problem in trying to educate people by using falsified information. So Wells writes, nevertheless, evolutionary biologists have been reluctant to abandon Darwin's theory. Why? Well, because they don't want to give, creationists a reason to think that they're right about that. But but the point is that's not science. Science is a willingness to abandon previous incorrect thinking in favor of greater precision and accuracy. And a lot of people want to hold on to this. Now, we do this. This is okay. Sometimes we have a rescuing device. We hold things as our basic understanding of the way we think about the world. And when someone gives us information that seems to counter that, our automatic reaction can't be just to abandon it automatically. But it also can't be that we just hold on to something that isn't true. And so many Darwinists are reluctant to abandon this aspect of Darwin's theory, so they keep holding on to it. The branching tree pattern of evolution is inconsistent with the fossil and molecular evidence, meaning the fossil record doesn't show anything like that, of a branching tree of life, and the molecular evidence doesn't show anything like that either, in the sense that you don't see this modification over time from a single point of origin or a few single points of origin. The Cambrian explosion demonstrates the highest categories of animals appeared first, making the tree virtually upside down, that it basically works the other way. The author of this book, Icons of Evolution, talks about the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, California. He talks about a visit he had there, and this area in the museum at the time called the hard facts wall, where you're just supposed to look and see the facts, and you have different goggles and things that you look in, and you see the information there right in front of you. And there was the phylogenetic tree of life, which is basically the idea of that the different phylum and different genetics have developed over time of these major animal phyla, just what Darwin was talking about. From a few became many. Few or one became many. That was the kind of the theory of the tree of life. So this hard facts wall at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, California, at least when this book was written, presents this. It's the tree of life. Darwin wrote, or based off of that same type of thinking. It says the branches of the tree are decorated with magnifying glass, and you're supposed to be able to look under the magnifying glass and see it. The author of this book says that the magnifying glasses have nothing under them because there's no evidence to see, because this is not how it works. It denies the molecular evidence, it denies the fossil evidence, but it's still used as a set of evidence for a particular theory of evolution. The National Academy of the Sciences booklet in 1998, so a little bit dated, but I doubt they've corrected this mistake, said scientists most often use the word fact to describe an observation. Okay, well, fair enough. But scientists can also use fact to mean something that has been tested or observed so many times that there is no longer a compelling reason to keep testing or looking for examples. The occurrence of evolution in this sense is a fact. Scientists no longer question whether descent with modification occurred because the evidence supporting it is so strong. I say, okay, facts usually mean observations. That's what science is supposed to be, empirical observational science built on certain presuppositions of following the scientific method. Okay, that's good. And there's a point too that there comes a point when, with gravity or something like that, a law of gravity, where you test it so much it doesn't need to, we can assume gravity, okay, as a law, as a fairly constant. That doesn't mean that there isn't some Nobel Prize out there for someone who's a little bit more precise on what the meaning of gravity actually is. There are times like Einstein, Copernicus, people sit down and they basically rewrite paradigms of how the universe works, but it's usually fairly rare. Okay, but the National Academy of the Sciences, which we pay tax dollars for, by the way, says scientists no longer question whether descent with modification occurred because the evidence is so strong. The problem is, and they write this booklet, the National Academy of the Sciences booklet, which the link is here, Science and Creationism, a view from the National Academy of the Sciences in 1999, says the fossil record thus provides consistent evidence that change through time, of descent with modification. Okay, well, that's true in a sense. There is descent with modification. Descent with modification, though, is not what is being implied here in the most literal sense. Descent with modification means that, contra Darwin's tree of life, descent with modification is that there is a limitation of DNA material and information over time, leading to the extinction and limitation of species that don't survive, and that there are adaptations within those kinds. But usually what descent with modification is saying is that there is a point of common origin, and that there is a divergence from there that becomes all the species and kinds, adding information over time to what we see today, which is not true and not what the evidence shows. There's no mention in this booklet from 1999 of the Cambrian explosion. Major paradigm shifting discovery, in fact, that the evidence shows this sudden appearance of these kinds of species all at once, fully formed. And whatever mechanism we want to put on that, that's what the evidence shows. And it doesn't mention any of the problems with Darwin's theory, which is part of what science is to help people think through. Okay, here's the theory, here's the issues with it. Can we resolve them? Are there other thoughts on this? This is why you need a philosophy of the sciences as well, because you have to bring in good patterns of logic and thinking, not just coming up with theory and trying to justify it. The tree of life is still used as an illustration in textbooks. Time magazine came out in 1995 with an article, When Life Exploded, talking about the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of life fully formed. The Cambrian explosion is a well-known fact by 1995. But remember, 1999, they're still producing this from the National Academy of the Sciences with our tax dollars in 1999, really basing it off of more of Darwin's theory of the branching tree of life, not mentioning the Cambrian explosion, not mentioning the problems, not mentioning the major changes. But Time magazine is talking about this, about evolution's Big Bang. The Cambrian explosion was on the cover of the 1995 issue on December 4th, When Life Exploded, Evolution's Big Bang, talking about this. But textbooks and National Academy for the Sciences, these more monopolistic entities, are still using outdated information to try to prove aspects of a theory that they believe in, using things that are not accurate, things that are not true. Personal story, just to finish here, with the author of this textbook. He talked to a Chinese paleontologist and an expert in Cambrian fossils. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical of this quote. I believe it happened, but I would like a little bit more documentation of it. But he said this was a personal comment made to him by a Chinese paleontologist and expert in Cambrian fossils. And so they talk and have this conversation. And he said he kept his name anonymous because of the basically academic elite in the United States not accepting this person's contributions in academic papers in the academic world because of his questioning of Darwinism. And this Chinese paleontologist and expert in Cambrian fossils is an evolutionist, not somebody who is a creationist, not a Bible believer. But listen to the quote as shared in this book. He says speaking of the academic system in the United States with regard to these things, he says, in China, we criticize Darwin, but not the government. In America, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin.